Shivering is one of the strongest stimuli that one can incorporate to stimulate fat loss. But you have to do it correctly. And most of the people suggesting cold as a means to increase metabolism fat loss are suggesting the exact wrong protocol. In fact, the one I'm going to recommend is 180 degrees in the opposite direction to the typical protocol that you'd hear about. So we have several kinds of fat, 3 kinds in fact. We have white fat, white adipose tissue, and we have brown fat or brown adipose tissue. And there's a third kind, which is beige adipose tissue. White fat is the type that we traditionally think of as fat. Brown fat has a particular biochemical cascade whereby it can take food, basically, break it down, and convert it into energy within those cells. And there's some additional steps involved. Brown fat is thermogenic. It can actually use energy directly. Beige fat is sort of in between. It's white fat that could be brown fat because it has some mitochondria in it, but not as many as brown fat. Now, cold exposure does several things. Making ourselves cold can allow us to build up mental resilience, because getting into cold of any kind, doesn't matter if it's a cold day and you forgot your sweater or your parka, or you're lying down in the snow. Cold causes the release of adrenaline from your adrenals, and it causes the release of epinephrine from these neurons that connect to fat. Now, the big effects of cold on metabolism and fat burning are going to be through 2 routes. One is that if you expose yourself to cold, you have the opportunity to trigger activation of brown fat, as well as to convert more beige fat into true brown fat. So you essentially create a stronger or a hotter furnace. That's the way to think about brown fat. It's like a furnace. And so with this principle that we started with of calories in versus calories burned, what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of burning, you're increasing the burn of energy by increasing the intensity of the heat inside you, so to speak. Now, how can you do that? Well, if you get into cold water or a cold day and you try and remain calm and resist shivering, you actually short circuit this mechanism for increasing brown fat thermogenesis. The paper published in Nature shows that it is shivering itself that causes the brown fat to increase your burn rate and your metabolism. And it works like this. When you get into cold and you shiver, the shivering triggers the release of a molecule called succinate. Succinate acts on the brown fat to increase brown fat thermogenesis and fat burning overall. It actually increases body heat through this brown fat thermogenesis pathway. And it also, over time, can increase the amount of brown fat by converting beige fat into true brown fat. Now, how much cold exposure and how often, that's the key. But before I give that detail, remember, if you resist the shiver, you are not going to get the increased metabolic effect because you are not going to get the succinate release. So if you want to get your body heat, your thermogenic level to go up, you need to shiver. So how many times a week do you need to expose yourself to cold will depend on how much fat you're trying to lose and how much you're trying to increase your metabolism. There are studies that describe positive effects on fat loss of exposing yourself to cold either through cold shower or through ice bath or other cold water for anywhere between 1 and 5 times per week. But it turns out that just 1 exposure per week can be valuable. So first, let's talk about how long to get into that cold environment. Most of you might think, oh, well, if 1 minute is good, 3 minutes is better. And if 3 minutes is better, then 10 minutes is best. But remember, the goal is to get the shiver-induced release of succinate so that succinate can trigger the brown fat. It turns out that if you want to trigger the shiver, what you want to do is to get into the cold and then get out of the cold and typically not dry off, and then get back into the cold and out of the cold. That will definitely stimulate more shivering than just getting into the cold itself. So what I'm not referring to is getting into the cold environment like an ice bath and waiting until you shiver and staying there shivering. Okay? You also don't want to get hypothermic, and I want to be clear, you want to get approval from your doctor before you do any of this. When you get into cold water, there are 2 factors that will dictate whether or not you shiver. One is how cold it is. So how cold should it be? Just cold enough to be uncomfortable is a good place to start. So for some of you, that's going to be 60 degrees. For some of you, that's going to be 55 degrees. For some of you, it's going to be high 30s, right? Depends on how cold adapted you are. So what you need to do is find a temperature that you can get into 1 to 3 times a week if you really want this to accelerate fat loss. And you want to get in until you just start to shiver. And then you want to get out and not dry off. Wait anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes and then get back into the cold. So here's a potential protocol that you can play with. Find a temperature that induces shiver for you. 1 to 3, maybe 5 times a week. Get in until you, or get under the shower or whatever it is, until you start to shiver, genuinely shiver. Then, after about a minute or so, get out. Spend 1 to 3 minutes out, but don't dry off. Get back in for anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, but try and access the shiver point again. And you might do 3 repetitions of that. So it's 3 times in and 3 times out total. Okay? What you don't want to do is build up your tolerance to cold so fast that pretty soon you're able to resist the shiver, because remember, the shiver is the source of the succinate release that will trigger brown fat thermogenesis.